As the Civil War kind of limped towards its dramatic grand finale, a larger-than-life gentleman swaggered into Missouri's St. Louis Southern Hotel and made himself right at home. Oh God, is my chin melting off again? I feel like Mrs. Doubtfire. He was built like a grizzly bear, ate like he was prepping for hibernation, and had the table manners that would make a Viking proud. With huge wads of cash that never seemed to run out and a knack of spinning the most amazing life stories, he just had the staff eating out of his grubby little hands. Alexander Thompson, he was all charm, all flair, and just shady enough to keep interesting. But things were not as they seemed, madam. A decade later, the friends Alexander had made at the Southern Hotel were gooped and gobsmacked over the fact that they had drank and shared laughs with one of the most evil mass murderers of the 19th century. But wait, darling, we are getting way fucking ahead of ourselves. Let's bring this back to the beginning. Alexander was born in the Scottish Highlands in 1827, and he really liked to go by the name Sandy, so that's what we'll call him. As a young boy, he hopped across the pond over to Canada and landed himself a job at his uncle's brewery. And Sandy's uncle wasn't just any old fart knocker, he was a big shot businessman and a 3-time mayor of Halifax. And rather than learning his uncle's tricks of the trade for success, Sandy quickly became kind of a jealous little stain. He started forging his uncle's name on important documents and bills, and it's thought that he may have even been responsible for blowing up a powder magazine to cover up stealing gunpowder. What a little face, right? Damn. See, this is exactly why I don't have children, because I know they'll do shit like that. Because I did shit like that. Then, when the Civil War started, Southern blockade runners began arriving in Halifax, hoping to score some profits. I did have to Google what the fuck a blockade runner was, but it's just a giant ship that transports goods between the North and the South. But Sandy was like, honestly, I could make some money here. So he became a purchaser for the ships, filling them with goods to transport, and built a really good relationship with these runners. And he was making an ass ton of money, like hand over fist, faster than he could snort or drink his way through it. As the war grew ever hungrier for Confederacy, this is when Sandy's spree of shit really started. At this time, Southerners were hiding up in Canada and were planning terrorist attacks all along the border. And Sandy was kind of in the middle of this, like a lot of the people doing the attacks were his transport friends he'd made. And he could either turn a blind eye and pretend it's not happening and face losing business relationships, or he could join in the attacks. And we're here, so you know which route he took. And he was kind of like a double agent for these people, but this was the 1800s, so the most techie thing they had was a rectal thermometer that could also be used as a coffee stirrer. But his first task was actually potentially ruthless. Sandy was to have clothes transported through Halifax and then down to the northern cities. At this time, Halifax wasn't just a pit stop, it was a Confederate version of like a VIP lounge. Britain officially opposed slavery, but they weren't about to turn away from the gold pouring into their economy from these shady-ass business deals, so shady could come through Halifax as a gateway and then be dispersed through the US. And just having clothes transported seems innocent, but this was actually considered bioterrorism. Get this. So one of Sandy's clients, he was a doctor, his name was Dr. Luke Blackburn. He volunteered his services to yellow fever patients in Bermuda, which sounds lovely, right? Like a little Bahama mama on the beach after work? No! This bastard of a doctor collected all the soiled linens and clothes of these sick people, and now they were hoping to spread yellow fever to the north to wipe them out, but the foolish fucks didn't know that yellow fever was transmitted by mosquitoes, not human contact. Oops. Oop, chin repositioning. There we go. But a doctor did this of all people. Like, who the fuck can we trust? As if we haven't covered like 12 murderous doctors on here. And this man, this absolute dumpster fire of a human, campaigned for office in Kentucky and somehow won to be governor. Like, Kentucky girl, you okay? You need some milk? Oh! Time moves on, and by the end of 1864, the blockade runners were now itching to squeeze the last bit of profit out of the business before their inevitable defeat. And Sandy's like, well, how can I help them? But most importantly, how can I help myself? Well, he had heard of this amazing contraption recently called a time bomb. Currently, there were Confederate bomb makers that could time their explosions, which inspired the hell out of Sandy. His inner pyro was just flicking its beam like a maniac. He's like, yeah, I could do that. I could make a bomb, totally. I just whip something up from what I have in the cupboard. That idea would have to wait though, because currently he was dealing with $1 million in investments from his friends. You know, just another little side hustle that he had. And sure, he could grow this money, but what he'd grow it to would never get him $1 million. So in the veil of a starless night, Sandy, his million Skrilla, and his chambermaid girlfriend Mary fled the Halifax hotel he was staying at and started going on a spending spree in Boston and New York. Ooh, that sounds fun. I mean, not the stealing part, but the spending. This little poodle is a shopper. Oh, a lavish apartment, eating beluga caviar off of black rhino horn spoons, and swallowing diamonds just to hear the chink in the toilet later. This was lovely, sure, but one day a bullet came whizzing in Mary and Sandy's living room window, and Sandy knew it was time to get the fuck out of town. He didn't need a flaming arrow with a note stuck to it to know that this was his old comrades, aka the friend investors trying to get back their dough. And this was enough for Sandy to tell Mary to go beat off. No, to go beat it. Yep, there we go. And he took his bag of money and skipped town on the back of a rail car all the way down to St. Louis. And he felt comfy here. The town was pretty divided in loyalties and had its own history of devious Confederate schemes. And he kinda liked that. Daddy's got a dark side. No, but all jokes aside, like, that. Before he had arrived, there were infamous boat burners who would sneak around the docks at night and set fire to the boats or put bombs in their coal burners so they'd explode. And they did this to almost like 60 ships, killing countless soldiers and innocent civilians. Like, what the fuck? Right? What a crazy-ass time. Sandy liked this energy, though. Rather than a morning cup of coffee and a meditation, he'd look out his window and reminisce on how glorious that must have been to blow up those boats. Actually, we should take a suspicious shot for that. Yes, he was at a safe haven at this hotel, the same hotel where we started our story. The building was a lovely smoker's teeth creamy yellow with a cheerful air about it, which is probably why he loved being there so much. He was rich as shit. He could drink at the hotel bar, make friends, tell stories, and go back to his plush feather bed and luxurious suite. But it seemed the Confederate network had long testicles. Nope. Long tentacles. Both. Maybe. Soon, Sandy was tracked down by a detective who was hired by someone who had stake in that $1 million investment he'd stolen. Sandy was like, I can give you a handy J and $5,000 to shut the fuck up. And the detective was like, you got a deal. So Sandy ran to his room at full speed, 2 stairs at a time, wiped his hand off, threw his neti pot lotion and money into a bag, and fled about 30 miles east to Highland, Illinois. And this didn't turn out to be all that bad of a place. There were beautiful Swiss immigrants in town, and he happened to meet a small, dark-eyed woman named Cecilia who buttered his biscuit and then some. She had no idea of the shenanigans he'd been up to. In fact, she didn't even know he had money at first. At this point in his life, he'd had many a harlot in his bed sheets, but he was done with that now. He didn't want to be irresponsible alone anymore. After a few months of courtship, Sandy asked Cece to marry him, and she adoringly said yes. Young love. Actually, I don't know how old they were. And I bet her nips just popped like firecrackers from shock when she found out about the load that was sitting in him. No, the load he was sitting on. Really gotta pick my words better. His money, though, it didn't change Cece. It just made it so they could both settle into a comfortable life. That is, until a chilly day in December, the couple awoke to a pounding on their door. Still shaking off the morning wood and eggnog hangover from the massive party they'd thrown the night before, Sandy opened the door and immediately his nuggets jumped up to his throat. Standing there was a U.S. Marshal, a St. Louis detective, and one of Sandy's money-stealing victims named Smoot. Smoot. Sandy had stolen $25,000 from Smoot, and he wanted his money back right the fuck now. The men grabbed Sandy in his nightgown, stuffed him into the back of a cop car, and hauled him into jail until he could come up with enough money to satisfy Smoot. Guess he hadn't heard about Sandy's famous handies. Of course, though, he still had enough money to pay Smoot off, but this was a terrible kink in his plan. Not even the fun kind with whips. Sandy was released out of jail, but they really had to start thinking shit over. Cece didn't know Sandy's financial status. She just knew he had dough, not that the dough was about to be cooked. They basically had bathed in fine champagne, thrown parties like Anna Wintour was hosting, and given away albino peacocks as party favors. And they hadn't exactly been low profile either. You know, renting penthouses, eating scallops for breakfast, and nearly extinct animals for dinner, and spending cash like they were allergic to savings accounts. Well, that shit had to stop, and the near $1 million they'd already spent, well, that needed to be replaced because there was no way they could go back to any other way of living. Once you regularly sip fancy champagne, everything else just tastes like piss water, you know? Ask Beyonce. So Sandy pours himself a tall glass of Dom and racks his brain trying to think of an idea to get him some serious loot. Just as the scruffy cheek was about to hit the table, he fell out of his stupor, jumped up, and said, "Holy shit, on a Triscuit, I've got it." He'd pull from his old days as a goods exporter. The plan was perfect. All he had to do was get a bunch of useless shit, insure it for an ass ton of money, and then put it on board a ship. Then he could place a time bomb on board, which would go off in the middle of the ocean, taking down the boat, the crew, and all the evidence. Sandy would then collect a huge insurance check, and they'd be back to bathing in vintage wines in no time. But shocker, building a time bomb really wasn't as easy as he thought. Wow, who'da fucking thunk? He started trying his bombs on ships, and it was actually believed that Sandy had blown up a ship carrying theatrical costumes for John Wilkes Booth, who was performing in Montreal at the time. Why couldn't he have been on board? By the 20th try, Sandy was like, okay, we got this. Eventually, he set his sights on the steamship Mosel, which currently happened to be docked. Sandy took out a $150 insurance policy on this barrel, which he had told loaders was full of caviar. But I'm like, $150, is that right? I feel like it had to have been more because, like, why even bother for $150? But this barrel, totally full of caviar and not a bomb. It was a brisk December day in 1875, and Sandy boarded the cruise ship across from the Mosel under the name Willie. He was given a flute of champagne and was getting comfy in his first-class room when he peered outside his luxurious window. He could see his barrel being loaded by the other ship, the barrel that was filled with dynamite, the barrel that was being lifted by a very untrustworthy seeming rope winch, and the same barrel that snapped the rope, plummeting the container down where it exploded on the dock. The scene looked like a battlefield. Even Sandy had to step back because his cabin window blew out. Wood was everywhere. The bow of the ship caved in, cabins imploded, bloody sand threw out both boats. This was like a true disaster. Pieces of twisted iron were sticking out everywhere like booby traps that had impaled passengers like shish kebabs. Sandy could hear children outside of his cabin coughing with a gurgled sound as though their lungs were burnt and punctured. Black, noxious smoke billowed up from every corner. Bodies were scattered everywhere like some deathly confetti. Sandy's blast had killed 81 people, mostly orphans and widows, and nearly fatally maimed 50 more. Sandy, who had just witnessed this from his expensive-ass suite, set back the pillow chocolate he was about to eat and went out to the deck to see the carnage he'd caused. This hadn't been his intention. He knew some people would die because of the bomb, but this was definitely not the plan. Once a fantasy, now a reality, and it wasn't as exciting as he thought it'd be. He certainly hadn't been planning on seeing any of this, which in his eyes was really all that mattered and was what fucked him up. Downing the bottle of schnapps he'd packed, Sandy went back to his room and began penning a letter to his wife. He exclaimed how he will never see her again and what he did he just can't bear. He also wrote a letter to the captain of the ship, professing his apologies and sorrow. Then he picked up the revolver he'd packed. Ship security back then was pretty lax. He put that gun to his head and he popped 2 bullets right into his noggin. Rescuers eventually found Sandy on the floor, groaning and bleeding, so they took him to the baggage hall, which had been turned into a temporary hospital. He lay among his victims as police interrogated him, and it didn't take long to extract a confession. A few days later, Cece was led to her husband in the hospital, where she begged the doctors to kill him and just put him out of his misery. She fell onto Sandy, pleading with him to repent his sins. With no luck, she's just asking for shit from everyone. All Sandy did was look at his wife and say his last words, which were, "I have been a thickhead. The fellows in New York are guilty." After Sandy's death, of course, a huge investigation ensued to find Sandy's real identity, all the crimes he'd committed, and who he was partnered with. Sandy's little terrorist comrades, well, they were in for a shitstorm. And now news was spreading rapidly in the papers of the latest ship explosions, and suddenly people were scared shitless to travel by ocean in case they were the next victim to these fucked up kind of criminals. Back in St. Louis, the staff at the Southern Hotel were picking their jaws up off the floor. They'd seen the latest newspapers and remembered the bearded man with the magnificent stories that now plastered the front page. One clerk decided that, ooh, it's my time to shine and get a few minutes of fame, so they waddled their ass down to the local newspaper. They told the reporter of all the stories this man had bestowed upon them, all the tales he'd spun around the things he'd done. Of course, the newspaper ran with the story like he was a fucking Kardashian, and funnily enough, the original detective who had been investigating Sandy and showed up on his door all those years ago, he saw these stories and hauled his sack out to St. Louis to confirm it. Nobody could believe the that Sandy had done. The coroner, seeing this as a fascinating case, requested permission to keep Sandy's head for scientific purposes. This was the 1800s. Nobody gave a shit. So Sandy's body was dumped into a random grave, but his head was kept in a jar on the coroner's desk. And then I guess it made its way to a local museum. Could you imagine the poor cleaning people dusting along and then coming upon that jar? God, I'd love that. Legend has it, though, that when the city was later being bombed, the jar burst and the head was mixed into all the other freshly dismembered body parts. And that is the tale of Sandy Thompson, who thoroughly sucked. What the fuck is wrong with people? Thank you so much for being here. I love having you. And don't forget, my latest Repop collection is out. It is wonderful. Please check it out. It's repopcosmetics.com. I'll see you there. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Follow me on social media. And have a beautiful day, my loves. I will see you again soon. Bye.